Hello, Dan McTeague, President, Canadians for Affordable Energy. Spent a lot of time in the energy field, but spent a lot of time in politics as well. 18 years as a member of Parliament, and of course, prior to that, in the trenches of the Liberal Party, going back to 1974, 78. Not many people can make that claim, but I'm 62, and most of my time has been spent in politics or issues that politicians tend to create. Now, look, before I begin, talking about a topic that's going to get more and more attention simply because the media seems to be all fawning over this guy, Mark Carney. I want to get a plug here, if I could, for donations. And come to affordableenergy.ca, come to our landing page there. And of course, if you can make a contribution, that would be certainly appreciated. We do a lot of research and a lot of work here, and we need to help. You need to help us do that in order for us to continue not just talking about the current issues of the day, but in many respects, as you've noticed over the past few years, we've been slightly ahead of ourselves, a little bit like the Panasonic people. Think about it, EVs, we got that right. Carbon taxes, we got that right. We also had to go very hard against the second carbon tax, the clean fuel standard. So all of these things we warned about very early on, long before anyone else did, turns out to be remarkably accurate. And that's because we have years and years of experience, private and public sector, to back up what we're doing, but we can't do it alone. Now, look, I want to talk a little about everyone's fascination now, certainly the media, paid media in many respects, and Mark Carney. There is a sense that they're giving this man a pass because the Liberals have basically shut down Parliament, haven't functioned properly since September, prorogued it, which should be unlawful. Certainly when you think about prorogation, I mean, the mother of all parliaments in the UK and Britain never shut down during the Second World War. Maybe a loss on people. Yes, it was bombed, but it never stopped. And yet Canada, during a time of apparent crisis, is doing just that. There's nothing happening, and we're not only giving Mark Carney briefings because after all, he was Trudeau's economic advisor for the past 5 years, so we can't say he's an outsider as he's claimed, falsely claimed. This is a man who has a rather checkered background, although he likes to. Let's start with the big one. Oh yeah, he came in 2008, 2009 as Bank of Canada governor and claimed he was able to help us get through the global recession. That's not true. That was David Dodge and Paul Martin Jr., my boss, as Prime Minister, who basically created the environment that cushioned the Canadian economy to absorb such a shock by not getting us involved in things like wild investments, derivatives, toxic assets, subprime loans, etc. So these are the guys that should be credited for what happened in Canada not having the experience the United States did and having come out of the recession much quicker. But I digress. More recently, our media and friends talk, oh, he's bank governor of Canada. He pardon the expression, he short-arsed it out of there and went to England, where he not only took the wrong side on the Brexit deal, he also inflated the money supply. In other words, he printed money and created a significant inflationary problem, which caused Britain a lot of economic chaos. So it's not so great. I can leave all those things aside because that's a kind of shameless self-promotion he's providing. One would have to do that if they think they're going to run for a party. What I find annoying is that he has uniquely worked with Brookfield Properties, and there are questions that have to be raised about his role in what's called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which basically throttled finances and told investment and banks, don't invest in oil and gas, even though the world needs more of it, like it or not. And the $2 to $3 trillion that we've spent over the past 20 years on renewables has dropped the amount of fossil fuel use globally from maybe 86% to 84%. In other words, not hardly even moving the needle. The reality is that last year, Mr. Carney came under some scrutiny because U.S. Department of Justice officials in the antitrust division said, what you're doing by getting all of the banks in the United States to stop lending to certain oil and gas companies amounts to a cartel. And he and the banks were going to be subject not just to an investigation, but under the American system, where they actually have a strong competition law. I know a lot about that because I tried to amend it here in Canada. They actually have triple damages. So if you hurt an oil company for, say, $1 billion, you have to pay $3 billion in damages. So one by one, all the big banks in the United States got out of it. They moved out of Mr. Carney's attempt at trying to constrict investments. The same thing in Canada and the same thing around the world. So we need to talk about Mark Carney in terms of throwing and debilitating an important sector of our economy. For Canada, oil and gas is our number one generator of revenue. Whether you like it or not, tell your trendy friends that is the case, and it pays for their social programs. But there's another aspect to this which has to be concerned. I want to know a little bit more about Mark Carney disclosing his assets. I want to know if he lives in Canada. What is his national background? Is he Irish? Is he British? Is he Canadian? Does he live in Canada? Has he lived in Canada? When's the last time he lived in Canada? What's his address? Those are simple things that you would normally ask of your politicians, but our media and the politicians and the Liberal Party doesn't seem to want to do that as they coronate Mr. Carney. Now, of course, there are people around Mr. Carney that have tremendous concern to me. Gerald Butts, Eurasia Group, that seems to be role. And of course, Mark Carney's wife works for Eurasia Group. This is a group that goes around the world grifting and telling us how to live our lives because of the new religiosity of the climate science. So I think it's important that we understand where his money is coming from, what he's been involved in, so that we can get clarity on why Brookfield Properties, for which he was director for many, many years, if not the chair, investing in pipelines in Brazil, investing in pipelines in the Middle East, but denying pipelines in Canada. We need to know more about the heating pumps issue in Canada. And I take the view as someone who comes from a family of electricians, it's not such a smart thing. In fact, on cold days that we've seen here in Canada, they don't work very, very well. They waste a lot of electricity. More importantly, I think we also need to look at things like Westinghouse. How did Brookfield Properties acquire Westinghouse then to turn it around into a new division called Brookfield Camco and sell it at several times the value which they bought the Westinghouse nuclear division, while advocating for more nuclear facilities in Canada? Not that I have a problem with that. I was an MP for Riding and Pickering, the first North American facility, but I digress. There are other factors I think here that have to be considered as well. When it comes to not only nuclear, but the role of Mr. Carney in terms of pushing things that may have had a substantial benefit for him or his company or those who agree with his policies. So rather than simply looking at a polished person that has a nice CV, when you look at it on its surface, there's a lot of us who have second thoughts and have a lot of questions for Mr. Carney, which of course certain media is not allowed to ask. That's not the way we run a democracy in this country. Anybody who wants to be the prime minister of this country should be absolutely accountable, not just to the Liberal Party and a handful of grifters who've done very well over the years, taking your money and stuffing their pockets with it. I'm talking about the real Canadians out there who are struggling, who are paying the bills, and who are trying to wonder why one person should have so much power to be able to decide which direction we should take. And by the way, that brings me to the question of his policy in terms of taking away the carbon tax. Suddenly, the carbon tax is not popular, even after they've been scamming and really hurting people with it over the past few years. Now they want to impose it on companies who will then pass it on to you. That's basically, that's a shell game, and we know that. So for all the reasons that I have just listed, these are important questions you will want to ask Mr. Carney and the Liberal Party, as so many in the media and so many who have accepted Trudeau over the past few years are willing to throw their support behind Mark Carney. It does require scrutiny, and it also requires us to consider that Mr. Carney is going to have to disclose his public assets, all of it. And if he goes quickly to an election while claiming to be prime minister, it's amazing. We have someone who's going to be a prime minister with no mandate, with no seat, and with no legitimacy. But many Canadians are already signing on board. You have to wonder about the 20 or 30% of Canadians who think that's a cool and trendy thing. Maybe after all, we have a very large number of people in this country who are willing to be more trendy, who are willing to be woke rather than being democratic and standing up for principle and working for a living. That's not a criticism. That's an observation. It happens to be damn accurate. And I'm putting my 30 some odd years of political work and skill and meeting and engagement on the line on this one. You vote for Mark Carney, you are voting for the further destruction of the country and perhaps a substantial decrease in your standard of living, which will be very difficult to recover. Be very careful, Canada. These are my warnings about Mark Carney. You could have ignored me on the carbon tax. You ignored me on the devastation of what happens when you block pipelines. You ignored me on the spending on EV mandates and the money we don't have. There are many other areas where we got it absolutely right on Mark Carney. Let me be very clear. Mark Carney will be bad for Canada and bad for our economy and bad for consumers. You want to restore affordability in this country, make sure that you oppose everything that this man represents, because his history, his background has been extraordinarily damaging to countries like Canada, and in particular, his leading of this Canada would be the irony of the century.